All right, so let's go over a little bit some of the evidences for evolution. What we're trying to answer is the question of why do we think that evolution explains all the diversity of life? So by the end, students hopefully will be able to describe how the diversity of life on the planet probably came to be. Some of the ways that we'll be able to do this is students should be able to describe major lines of evidence for evolution. Students should be able to describe how comparing different structures show how life changes over time. And then we should be able to explain as well how DNA evidence helps us to determine evolutionary relationships. So let's start. First, why do 99% of people who study this agree that this one idea, the idea of evolution, explains all the diversity of life? Let's talk about some of those reasons. Okay, so the evidences for evolution that we have, really it boils down to three different main things that when you put them all together, supports the theory. First, the fossil record. We have preserved remnants of ancient life that we can piece together in different ways to tell us the story of life itself. We have comparative anatomy. We can look and compare how things look when compared to each other in order to come up with some conclusions, right? Like this middle bit here. And then we have DNA evidence. How similar is the DNA between different organisms, and using that to try to construct a tree of life. So let's talk about the fossil record first. Just so we're all on the same page, a fossil is a preserved remain or trace of an ancient life form. And if we look carefully, we can see fossils that are changing over time to modern forms. So when we look carefully at the history of life in general, we have the remnants of a very small fraction of all of these things that have once existed. We can look very, very closely and see things like, oh, we found this bone structure on the left, and then we found this one, and then we found this one, and this one. And it's pretty easy to put those together to tell a story of an animal whose ancestors maybe had a little bit more wiggly fingers, but over time, the ecosystem and the environment acted on mutations in such a way to lead to a single toe, leading to a modern horse hoof, for example. And this picture is terrible, but it shows fairly quickly that we have all these fossils that we can put into order to show things like the evolution of chickens. Or we can show how they've evolved into whales, for example. We can see the ancient Pakicetus, which was an animal that walked on land, and we can see Ambulocetus and Myocetus and Dorodon and Basilosaurus. Then we can see how these limbs are slowly reducing over time and becoming more and more whale-like until we get to like the modern whale. So the fossil record is pretty compelling evidence that things change over time. We can see that populations will shift over time. Up until recent times, about the only thing we could compare, though, is this fossil record. We could look at the structures that animals have and compare them to modern animals and figure out what they were used for. And we could try to group organisms based on similarities and differences with their anatomy. So when we look at these pictures here, we can do things like, hey, let's look at embryos. Embryos don't change very quickly. So because they don't change very quickly, we can see some similarities, right? This one on the top, this one on the bottom, the one on the here, right? These are all different species. And whoops, I just noticed that these are different. This is a different language. But we can see this animal here at this is the first stage of embryonic development. This is the second stage of embryonic development. And this is one of the final ones. We can see that all of these embryos at the very beginning look very similar. And as time goes by, they start to differentiate, but they can still look somewhat similar until we get to the very end and we can see some drastic differences in how they look. Things like sheep and humans are very slow to diverge on the embryos. And this is a big argument for that all life is related, that at some point we had a common ancestor. Otherwise, why would all of our embryos look the same? We can do this across the board with other structures as well. If you look at the bone structure of humans, cats, whales, and bats, you will notice that they always follow the same pattern. You have a one bone, two bone, many bones kind of pattern. With a cat, you can see that same structure. You can even see it in the whale fin or in a bat wing, right? We see lots of structures that have come from a common ancestor and have changed over time to become something slightly different. But if you keep examining these, you can come up with like, oh, okay, if they share more traits and their embryos are more similar later in the development, they're probably more closely related. And we can make this family tree where these divergences here are trying to say that that's where the original population was, that then split into two brand new populations, right? So we can kind of figure out the order of all these different things and say like, oh, well, all the animals after this point have 4 legs and all the ones before don't, so therefore these are more closely related than these ones. And this works pretty well up until a certain point where we run into some problems. The problem is known as analogous structures. There are structures that do exactly the same function, but they came from a different ancestor. These organisms did not inherit their ability to fly from a common ancestor. If we look at a chart here, pandas have like an opposable thumb-like structure that they evolved independently from primates, who also evolved opposable thumbs. And rodents don't have opposable thumbs, but they're more closely related to us than pandas. So if we're relying on just structures alone, we could get very confused. We could say things like, rodents and are less related to all of these, whereas pandas and chimpanzees are more closely related, which would be wrong, right? But these analogous structures are really tricky to get around and figure out, okay, then who's more related to who? So the way that we fix this, there is a solution that has only come along in recent years, and that's simply DNA evidence. DNA always evolves. It always happens. And because DNA is evolving, we can show similarities in the DNA to show that organisms are more closely related. The more closely related you are, the more closely your DNA will be similar. This is very, very similar to me saying, for example, that me and my brother are related. So if you look at the DNA of me and my brother, it's going to be very, very close to each other. Whereas if we compare my DNA and your DNA, unless it's my brother that's listening to this, hi Spence, then our DNA is going to be more different than the DNA of me and my brother. So it's that same idea of trying to compare differences. We should be very aware, though, that mutations do occur randomly. And if they survive, like they don't kill the organism, most of the time they're going to be neutral. They won't do anything beneficial. They'll just kind of be hanging around, again, as long as they don't kill the organism that had the mutation. But these neutral mutations will start to accumulate over time. If we look at this original population here, we can see that over time, another population is going to accumulate more and more mutations as time goes by. And using this one trick, we can then compare this with the fossil record and start to come up with a way to indicate how closely related are. We can kind of double check things. We can realize things like, for example, that birds are dinosaurs. If you look at this original ancestor of dinosaurs, birds fit in that category. They're just the category of dinosaurs that did not go extinct. So a lot of people will distinguish between ancient dinosaurs and modern dinosaurs by saying, oh, these are the non-bird dinosaurs and these are the bird dinosaurs. We can do things and see like, oh, crocodiles are over here and turtles and reptiles are more closely related than others, but there's other weird ones over here, right? We can do all these different things and double checking by comparing DNA sequences and looking for whether or not these mutations have diverged too drastically. So let's put all the pieces together, okay? Let's tell our little story. Here's our story. Let me pull up my notes. So, Earth, imagine it, 4.5 billion years ago. Billion with a B. That is an incredible amount of time. Everything is molten lava. Nothing is alive on it. But eventually, the Earth starts to cool. Rains fall, oceans form, and in the waters of the Earth that have now been there, something extraordinary happens that we've never seen before and has never happened since, as far as we can tell. Life begins. At first, the early forms are very simple. They're tiny, single-celled bacteria with some kind of genetic code and some way to replicate themselves and create other things that are like them. That's what we're calling life at this point. But life, of course, is not static. Small changes occur. When one cell goes to copy itself, a mistake happens, or another mistake happens, or another mistake happens, right? We call these mutations. Sometimes they kill them. Oftentimes they do nothing. But sometimes some of those mutations, some of those differences make survival easier for some of the populations. Some make it harder, right? And the environment, depending on which environment they're in, will determine that fact. Are they helpful or are they hurtful? So as time goes by, here's our key idea. Life begins simple. But small changes over time shape the future. Those small changes are the mutations, the mistakes that, again, most of the time are going to hurt you, sometimes aren't, and sometimes benefit you. Eventually, we get to a point in time as life is dying and surviving, adapting and not, some of these little organisms, which we're going to call bacteria at this point, learn to capture the energy of the sun and start to do photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is extraordinary. It allows them to capture energy in a way that they were never able to do it before. In the process of doing this, though, they produced a waste product, which today we would not consider a waste product, the product of oxygen. Oxygen, for us, is something necessary, but in those days, nobody wanted oxygen. Oxygen became so overabundant in the atmosphere that it began, we think, to kill off many, many things, except for those that had the mutations that let them survive those scenarios. Cells begin to team up at this time period as well. They form partnerships. There are mutations that allow them to adapt and live with each other. This is what we begin to call eukaryotic life, life where organelles and nuclei and all these different things start to pop up. So at this point in time, we now have these very complex structures starting to come up where there's nuclei and cellular membranes, and they're teaming up and dividing the work and making things easier. And we at this point have about 3 different main populations of organisms on the face of the planet that we know of so far. We have bacteria, we have archaea, and we have eukarya. We're going to focus a lot on eukarya because that's the things that we can see with our eyes, so we tend to be quite interested in eukarya. The key idea here being that change is favoring the things that can adapt, the things that can create new opportunities for themselves, or that mutations gave to them a mistake that somehow allowed them to continue forward. The one change that predominated in this era was those that had mutations that let them collaborate with other cellular structures, allowed them to succeed, and they became the predominant structure of life. Then we begin to hit the phase of multicellular life, where eukaryotic cells begin to join together and form these incredibly complex structures. And we get what's called the Cambrian explosion. The Cambrian explosion was about 540 million years ago, a very long time ago. We start to get things like arthropods and primitive fish, and we start to get backbones, and billions and billions of organisms cover the thing. This is also the period in time where life begins to leave the ocean. We get funguses, we get plants, eventually we get animals moving onto shore as well. Fish have developed a way or had mutations that let them crawl a little further on land, which let them get a little bit more resources, which lets them go a little bit further, and some of their children had more changes that let them go further and capitalize on this uninhabited terrain. From this, the Cambrian explosion, we get many of the biggest and most important organisms that you recognize today. We don't see records of all of these things, but we get records in the fossil record of a bunch is a weird way of putting it. A giant explosion of life would be the best way to say this. So our key idea, right? Again, it's the same thing over and over again. Evolution's like a long-running experiment. Some forms will succeed, others will fade. Mutations are creating the variation upon which the environment can select for traits that succeed or don't succeed. The ones that succeed continue. Those that don't succeed fail. Eventually, we get to the era of the feathered reptiles. We think now that many of the dinosaurs that we grew up with and loved, right, is probably a little inaccurate. We have the skeletal structures of them, but we're starting to realize that many of them were probably feathered to some degree. It may not have been a complete coverage like some of these illustrations, but there was at least some feathers on some of them until the disastrous moment when a giant extinction happened. We think that most likely what happened is a meteor landed on Earth, covered the sky in darkness, and made it very hard for these large animals to survive. But there was this small class of organisms called theropods that were able to survive quite well during this period of time, that could hunt and survive and thrive, and they began to dominate. This is what we call the age of the mammals. Extinction, of course, is the rule. It is not the exception. Most life that has ever lived on Earth, 99% of everything that has ever evolved ever, is now dead. The world changes, new champions arise, and we get a new flood and variations and types of different things that we didn't see before. But eventually, if things follow the pattern of the past, most of what we see around us will go extinct at some point, and we'll end up with a brand new set of things. But this age that we have, where we had this enormous diversity of organisms, was fascinating. Some of these organisms that evolved during this time that took over from the reptiles were quite bizarre. Some of them returned to the oceans from which they came. We've been talking about these organisms. They moved onto land and then decided to move back into the ocean. These are the ancestors of whales. We have the first primate that we think that ever evolved, and life continued to develop, and evolution continued its way forward as the environment selected for favorable traits and killed off those that were not favorable. Mutations happened, leading to more variation, which the environment then selected for the favorable variation, and then those that didn't keep up died, so on and so forth. Eventually, we think that hominids have been around for longer than this, but we think modern Homo sapiens started roughly 200,000 years ago in Africa. We have fossils from back in that phase in time from that area, and we can track the spread of humanity across the world by finding different fossil records. And again, this fossil record isn't super complete, but we do see fossil records at these different periods. So it's possible humans moved into these areas before this point, but we definitely know they were there at least by this point. So the key idea here, right, is that so far, one of the most dominant species that's ever survived on the face of the planet, humanity, the greatest adaptation that has ever been has been intelligence and cooperation because humans. There's a pretty strong argument to be made for that. Of course, there's a very strong argument to be made for as well that bacteria doesn't see us or care about us that much because they're just that much in control of the world. But we'll talk about that another time. Evolution still continues to be a threat and or a concern and or a help in today's world. Our species is trying to keep up with the changing environment just like everyone else's. There are bacteria and viruses that prey on us, and that if we don't have enough variation in our systems to keep up with it, then we'll die. So one of the biggest benefits of medicine is that it helps us kind of increase our own variation in our population by dealing with things we may not have been able to deal with anyways. But medicine isn't perfect. There are things like methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, which is causing problems in hospitals. There's things like COVID-19. There's the common flu that happens every single year and kills between 20 and 50,000 people, right? There's malaria. There are so many diseases and things out there that cause problems for humanity. And as we continue to evolve, all that means is that those that don't have the genetic variation to keep up will die, and those that do have the genetic variation to keep up will survive. Medicine just lets us spread around the survivability for as many people as we can. So the final key idea, evolution is ongoing. Life adapts, changes, reshapes itself endlessly, and this will continue forward forever. As long as there is pressures on life, life will respond. And that's our discussion about the evidences for evolution.